Welcome.
Okay, okay. Now, can I start? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the today's webinar on Indian Writings in English, Need for New Perspectives, organized by Internal Quality Assurance Cell and Department of English of Atmaram Sanatan Dham College. On behalf of IQAC, I welcome the speaker of today's webinar, Professor Sutanu Satpathy, Professor of Eminence, K.R. Mangalam University, and former Professor and Head, Department of English, University of Delhi. Sir, we are really honored that you took out your valuable time for us. Our college has successfully conducted several webinars during this lockdown period under the able guidance of our respected principal, Sir, Dr. Gyantosh Kumar Jha. Now, I would like to invite the principal of the college to welcome the guest and say a few words. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I was audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Previously, I was audible previously?
Yes. To everyone, yes.
Yeah.
Ravinder,
Yes, sir.
I am audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sorry.
Sir, I have invited you. Yeah, please come, sir.
Professor Somya Satpathy and all the participants, on behalf of the college, I welcome you all in this webinar. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Satpathy in this webinar on a very relevant and contemporary issue. I think and I hope that this webinar will give more insight on the subject. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you here, Professor Satpathy, in this webinar. Whenever I have heard you and I have interacted with you, I got some valuable knowledge from you. So I am expecting same from you today also, and I think everybody will be benefited from your lecture. Once again, I welcome you all. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now I invite Dr. Gautam Chaube, Program Convener, to carry forward the program.
Thank you, ma'am. Honorable Principal Dr. Gyantosh Kumar Jha, Dr. Anju Bajaj, my members of the webinar committee, fellow colleagues from the department, fellow colleagues from other colleges, students from the college, students from other colleges, and everyone who is watching us and following us on Facebook Live. It's my privilege, it's our singular privilege that Professor Sumanyu Satpathy is here with us. And in his case, the oft-used phrase, it doesn't need introduction, it makes sense. Because in various capacities, Professor Sumanyu Satpathy is responsible for the education of many of us who have joined live today to hear him on the subject in ways that we know, in ways which are direct or indirect, in ways that we can fathom or at times cannot comprehend. Sir has been an influence on the English department for almost a decade, beginning with the way we conduct examinations or the way we conduct research, the way syllabus is overhauled. And in that sense, he has been a pioneering scholar and a beacon of light and inspiration and a motivation for many of us. Sir, the topic for the day, sir agreed, and it was his own choice. Sir said that he'd like to speak on the need for new perspectives in Indian English writings. And as is the case with him, he always pioneers a new way of looking at subjects and a new way of doing research, which is very evident from the kind of books that he has written, the kind of research that he has conducted. Some of his works we are already familiar with. Those students would have read the great, the wonderfully edited volume of Heart of Darkness, which Sir has edited. Some of his recent publications include The Will to Argue, which is a take on literary controversies in colonial, late colonial and post-colonial, early colonial times. Then Sir has pioneered the work on Indian nonsense in a book published by Penguin called The Tenth Rasa. Sir has also published another work called Southern Colonialism. Apart from that, Sir has also introduced and, in a sense, foregrounded the need to engage with Indian literature, Indian criticism in a big way, which is evident by the fact that he has edited, brought out and edited, co-edited work, a volume on the translated essays of a renowned Uriya critic, Dr. Samantarai, which was published by the Sahitya Academy in 2017. And he has also brought out another volume in 2019 titled Signifying the Self, Women and Literature. As far as the subject for the day is concerned, am I audible to everyone?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so as far as the topic for the day is concerned, as someone who has pioneered so much, as someone who has brought so many new perspectives in the way we conduct our research, in the way we conduct our methodology, I think the less I speak, the better it is. It's for Sir to decode, and I welcome you, Sir, and I welcome everyone. And now I hand it over to you. Thank you, Sir.
Hello, everyone. Let me say right at the beginning, it's a privilege and honor for me to be engaged in this webinar with my former students and many of my colleagues, the principal. It's good to, it's like getting back home, ghar wapashi, as it were, speaking to and listening to, my colleagues with whom I spent so much time, such wonderful time, very fruitful scholarly engagement. Dear Mr. Principal, Dr. Anil Kumar, thank you very much for asking me to be a part of this. I congratulate you for this kind of initiative. I hope I'm audible, God.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Jha, I congratulate you for initiating this kind of scholarly interaction during lockdown time when all of us are cut off from the rest of the world. But so what, with the help of technology and your wonderful team, we are able to see each other, talk. It's almost, though we say that it's a virtual world, it's almost like talking to each other. When I saw Maitri, Gautam, and everyone else, it was like meeting you all directly. So thank you, Dr. Gyanendra Kumar Jha, and members of the webinar committee, Dr. Vinita Tuli, Dr. Anju Gulati, and of course my dear students and now my friends, Maitri and Gautam and the others I saw on the screen. The topic of my lecture or webinar today is self-chosen, as Gautam said, Indian writing in English. Yes, I use it in the singular, not the way it is advertised. I don't call it Indian writings in English, but I always prefer Indian writing in English. That doesn't mean that there is just one kind. This is what I'm going to say in today's paper. The need for newer perspectives. It's an old subject, old rubric, Indian writing in English. As my colleagues know, and many of our students would also know, this came under different names, and finally, I think we have more or less settled down Indian writing in English. Now, this is a vast topic. It's a challenging subject. For on the one hand, there is too much that can be said about it, and on the other, too little that would be construed as new and original. Ever since the 19th century, questions have been raised over English as a vehicle for creative expression in India. Though this question kept surfacing intermittently, the vexed issue reached a crescendo during the years preceding and succeeding the Golden Jubilee celebrations of India's independence in 1997. In spite of writers and critics, every time we meet in seminars, or book release functions. Writers and critics often say that the issue is dead and buried. You know, there are many contentious issues around Indian writing in English. In spite of these broad claims, one still encounters attack on and defense of Indian writing in English. Why in English? Is it better or worse? You know, I am keeping in view that I'm addressing a large number of students. Of course, my colleagues are there, and some of whom have done a lot of research themselves in this field. But I have the interest of the students in mind. I hope I'm right in assuming that a large number of students are also listening to me. I shall do neither. I shall neither attack nor defend Indian writing in English, the writers who choose English over other Indian languages. However, since Meenakshi Mukherjee's interventions have acquired greater visibility, especially among academics, I shall invoke two of her critical and influential formulations which have been debated. Way back in 1995, she was reviewing then newly published novel by Anita Desai called Journey to Ithaca. And she complained, Meenakshi Mukherjee complained of the strangeness of the world in Desai's novel. You know, I'm trying to quote it from memory, but I hope I'm very close to her formulation. She says that it's a strange world, unrelated to the Indian reality that the common reader living in India might be interested in. She also said, those of us who have to daily confront the concrete dimensions of the Indian reality may not, after all, be so beguiled by its elusive aura. This is what she said. Mukherjee sees in such novelistic worlds as Anita Desai's what she calls the Indian English writers' anxiety of Indianness. Anxiety of Indianness. It will be better if we mute our microphones for the time being, unless, of course, there is time for asking questions. So she calls this the anxiety of Indianness. Now, this is a phrase that has acquired some fame and notoriety. That is, far removed from their lived experience, these writers, those writers who write in English, Meenakshi Mukherjee thinks that they are removed from the location about which they are writing. They constantly try to conjure up in their own fiction what might sound authentically Indian, such as Bhel Puri or Pav Bhaji, or scenes of squalor and poverty like Slumdog Millionaire, but fail to do so. In another essay, Meenakshi Mukherjee says, she speaks of how IWE for short, you know, I won't repeat the phrase Indian writing in English again and again, I will call it IWE, and Indian writing in English translation. These two, you know, there's a lot of Indian writing in English translation, some of which are prescribed in the syllabi in departments of English. They are divided by the same language. What she's saying is that though many of the Indian writers who write in the Indian languages think that if they are translated into English, they will become world famous. Meenakshi Mukherjee begs to differ. She says that there is a market for original Indian writing in English, which is quite sought after in the Anglophone world. And there is a lot of Indian writing in English translation, which no one cares for. So it's not the divide between writing in Indian languages and writing in English. It is about even Indian writing in English translation. So there is a disparity. Then she speaks of the emergence of more and more IWE writers who are propelled by the logic of social dynamics within the country, lured by the forces of the global marketplace and driven by the mirage of international fame. These are her phrases. These observations elicited responses from the writers themselves soon after the review came out. And off and on, there have been debates. One of Meenakshi Mukherjee's antagonists is Vikram Chandra, the novelist. But between then and now, such questions may perhaps have lost their validity with the emergence of an overwhelming number of young writers such as Anand Nilakanthan, Devdutt Patnayak, Chetan Bhagat, Ashwin Sanghi, and Amish Tripathi, just to name a few of the most popular writers. However, purists like Amit Chaudhary might begrudge, however much purists like Amit Chaudhary might begrudge their success, any discussion of contemporary Indian writing in English must take them and their success into account and rethink the category IWE as promised in the title of my talk. To begin with, lest you might be wondering what this new perspective is. To begin with, the now gargantuan body of writing is no longer an indiscriminate bolus, and we can do better than identifying and conveniently slotting a few of our favorite authors around whom we develop our own pet theories. What I suggest here is that IWE can be examined under three broad categories on the basis of the writer's location. Where are these writers writing from? And based on that, we can think of three broad categories of Indian writing in English. For it is in their respective locations which shape their, it is their respective locations which shape their imaginative world and the Indianness. Or rather, Indiannesses, you might prefer, that there is no one India, there are many Indias, so there are Indiannesses of their themes, which in turn is overdetermined by the material conditions of the writers. I shall now proceed to suggest how this happens by outlining the three categories. I must clarify at the outset that these categories I propose are by no means rigid. There are overlaps. They are more indicative than definitive. The first category of IWE is dominated by writers from the metropolitan centers, often referred to as the children of Midnight's children. That is, the many writers who followed Rushdie's to the fore. These are writers who wrote with a new kind of confidence that one rarely came across in their predecessors. The names of writers who can be grouped under this category are Vikram Seth, Anita Desai, Rohinton Mistry, Vikram Chandra, Kiran Desai, Amit Chaudhary, Jhumpa Lahiri, Chitra Banerjee, Divakaruni, Jeet Thayil, to name just a handful. There are many more. What is common between them is that, like Rushdie, they are diasporic subjects and often harken back to their work, harken back in their works to and invoke their homeland, imaginary or otherwise. If one examines their respective career graphs, one notices that many of them were born and educated early in India in premier institutions, and they have gone abroad for further studies, published and become famous, winning significant international prizes, and have stayed there ever since, with a few exceptions like Shashi Tharoor, who returned to India. I do not know whether Shashi Tharoor can now be called, when diasporic literature was in vogue in the 90s, he was among the diasporic writers, but now that he is a member of parliament, I doubt whether he can still be called a diasporic. So there is a lot of ambivalence and fluidity about these categories, but by and large, yes. Their works got highlighted as expected academics such as Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha themselves, who are in similar locations, canonized them, these writers, under the broad academic rubric of post-colonial studies, postmodern literature, and so on and so forth. More often than not, their authorial perspectives suited the Western reader's idea of India. For example, the main and subplots of Rohinton Mistry's A Fine Balance are drawn around arranged marriages, dowry system, caste and communal relationships, where the idea of India is essentialized and not seen in terms of its complexity. Chitra Divakaruni similarly writes about the three Indian M's: magic, mythology, and masala, that is, mistress of spices. But what about the present, still younger crop of writers in this category who belong to this category of diasporic writers. Is there a noticeable shift in their writing from that of their counterparts in the older generation? Perhaps not much, according to me. For example, if you look at the works of Priti Taneja, who is famous for her work, famous in a limited sort of way, We That Are Young, where she overlays the plot of King Lear and writes about a rich industrialist in India and his 3 daughters. It's a very smart idea indeed, but critics abroad, while praising her for her novel, have also leveled the charge of transporting the corporate culture of the first world and superimposing it on India. Readers do not see in the novel much of what their everyday experience of India is. You know, it is very similar to what Meenakshi Mukherjee had said in 1995 about Anita Desai's Journey to Ithaca. But to think of all Indian writing in English along these lines runs the risk of homogenizing it. The aforesaid controversies flared up as the protagonists of the debate seem to have only these writers in mind and equating IWE with the work of only these expatriate or semi-expatriate writers, and thus could not see the wood for the trees. Their canonization as post-colonial, that is the canonization of these writers as post-colonial authors, earned the wrath of many, one of whom, Neil Lazarus, offered a spirited critique of the same, following Raymond Williams's methodology in critiquing the politics of modernism. I need not belabor the point here and move on to discuss the other 2 categories. My second category of IWE comprises the work of intra-country diasporic writers, Pravasis in the Indian phrase, within the Indian nation state. These writers or their parents may have been born in big or small Mofussil Indian towns in the hinterland, but have lived or moved to settle down in big Indian cities like Delhi, Mumbai, or Bangalore, and so on. From among the older generation of such writers, one can place Isim Ezekiel, Arun Kolatka, Keki Darwala, and from among a slightly younger generation, one can think of Mahesh Dattani, Arundhati Roy, Amitabh Ghosh, Rajkamal Jha, Sukrita Paul Kumar, Arvind Adiga, and so on. A few of them straddled both the worlds, the so-called first world and the third worlds, and shared the ideologies and aesthetic of the writers in the first category. Their India is urban, the writers of the second category. Their India is urban, upper middle class, elite. But the best among their work is evocative of much of the India that the urban reader is familiar with and can relate to. Indian poetry in English offers experiments and flourished with the works of bilingual poets like A.K. Ramanujan, Jayanta Mahapatra, and Arun Kolatkar, as well as Dilip Chitre. Though Kolatkar lived in Mumbai in the later part of his life, his early life in Mofussil towns like Kolhapur and Gulbarga shaped his works in Marathi and English. Though I name him here, I would prefer to bracket him under the third category, to which I move presently. But before that, among a much younger generation in this category, that is the second category of intra-country diasporic generation of writers. The writers that I have in mind are Chandrahas Chaudhary, who lives in Delhi or is Delhi-based, Amrita Mahale, who is Mumbai-based and is the author of Milk Teeth, and Prayag Akbar, author of Leela. Prayag Akbar, the son of M.J. Akbar. All 3 have been critically acclaimed, urban, suave, elite, who write about Indian themes which are mostly about the lives of people like themselves, with an occasional voyeuristic glance at slums and poverty. They feel that middle-class India is not written much about in literary fiction as much, or rather, which is what they are trying to do. That middle-class, lower middle-class life is not represented in a lot of Indian writing in English. So this is what they are trying to do. In fact, Amrita Mahale invokes the film world, the Mumbai or Bollywood film world, And she says that now it has come back into vogue. The portrayal of lower middle class families has come into vogue. But in between, for nearly 20 years or 30 years, this had gone out of fashion. I think it was in the 70s. She mentions that when it was possible to get a glimpse of middle class life in Indian cinema, particularly in the works of Amal Palekar, Hrishikesh Mukherjee, and one or two other directors. Mahale's milk teeth evokes middle class life in Mumbai or Bombay. She calls it Bombay because it's 1990s, soon after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. Before talking about the third category, I shall digress a bit and would like to say that like IWE, the bhasas or vernacular literatures are no indiscriminate bolas either. So just as Indian writing in English is thought of in terms of an indiscriminate bolas, Indian writing in Indian languages is also thought of as being, one homogeneous mass. But I suggest that they too come in many shapes and colors. Indian literature in Indian languages or literature in Indian languages. Many of the writers writing in these languages are social elites, migrants in big Indian cities, and their works are often as urban elitist as a few of their counterparts among IWE writers. They live in metros like Delhi, Mumbai, Mangaluru, and write about the urban middle class. One can think of the Kannada writer Vivek Shanbhag of Ghachar Gochar fame, a couple of years ago. His work, he was a writer in residence at Iowa, so he has been abroad. So it's not, he is no less than, in terms of being located in the metropolis, he is no less than his counterparts in the first group and even the second group. And then one comes across the works of the Odia Dalit writer, Akhil Nayak, who lives and writes from an obscure location of Odisha. So on the one hand, you have a prominent writer like the author of Ghachar Gochar, Vivek Shanbhag, who has been translated into many Indian languages. And on the other, you have a Dalit writer, Akhil Nayak, whose work was recently translated by my friend and colleague Raj Kumar, and it has been published by OUP. It's only because of its availability in English translation that some of us get to know about it. Otherwise, there is a big difference between the kind of world that Vivek Shanbhag evokes and the kind of world that Nayak evokes, from the back of nowhere. Now, to return to and focus on the classification under discussion, my third category of IWE writers is located, these writers are located in semi-urban mofussil towns. Among these can be counted, apart from Narayan himself from an older generation, a few older writers still living, such as Jayant Mahapatra, who lives and writes from Cuttack, Ruskin Bond, who lives and writes from, what is it called, in Mussoorie, Ruskin Bond, what is the place called, Mussoorie, and Manoj Das, who lives in Pondicherry, and many others who are not as well known as, say, Jayanta Mahapatra or Ruskin Bond, but they still are located in the hinterland, small mofussil towns. They write in English, mind you. So you can see the gap between the IWE writers in the first category and the IWE writers in the third category. Narayan and Manoj Das have worked into their fiction, their familiar landscape and culture, including the local mythology, by indigenizing the English idiom. Among the younger generation, who I slot in this group as well, one cannot afford to forget writers from Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Manipur, Meghalaya, and so on. Until the 1990s, anthologies of Indian English poetry did not mention any of the poets from these regions. And when Delhi University syllabus was revised, some of us took the initiative, and under the broad rubric of Indian writing in English, we included writers from the so-called Northeast. Mamang Dai is a poet, journalist, and novelist from Arunachal Pradesh. Robin S. Ngangom and Desmond Kharmoflang, these writers, they jokingly say that their friends used to call them when they were in college. The guy with a chewing gum name, Robin S. Ngangom and Desmond Kharmoflang, tongue twisters. And Sovendra Hansda Shekhar from Jharkhand, who is the youngest of the lot and who is a writer of prose fiction. Mamang Dai has moved away from her early romantic verse and stories to reflect on. She lives in Arunachal Pradesh, though she was, an officer in the Indian civil service. She quit her job and devoted full time to social work and writing. And now, in her words, she reflects on a close-knit community living in remote towns and villages of Arunachal Pradesh. Here, one cannot overestimate the claims of great merit that the Santhal writer I mentioned just now, Hansda, displays in his work, such as the mysterious ailment of Rupi Baski and the Adivasi will not dance. He got the best youth prize from Sahitya Academy, I think the prize from Sahitya Academy a few years ago. But he became controversial because some of his own people thought that, his work was obscene and he did not represent the tribal community in the proper light, in any proper light. But he happens to be the only Adivasi writer writing in English. If he's not the only one, I do not know who the others are. We haven't heard of them. Maybe they are writing, but he's certainly one of the very few writers. He is located in a place called Pakur. Have you heard where Pakur is? We all know where Bombay, Delhi, New York, all these cities are. But Pakur, the place Pakur comes last for everyone's information, according to a study in the Indian Express, among the 24 districts of Jharkhand. The last one in terms of development index. But then Hansda's work is also Indian writing in English. So this is the point I am trying to drive home. When we say Indian writing in English, we cannot take the name of Rohinton Mistry and Hansda in the same breath. Therefore, I propose here that thematically works in the third category of IWE connects to those in the Bhasa literatures. So just as I mentioned, among the Bhasa writers, there are categories like Akhil Nayak belonging to a similar category, though he is an Indian writer in English. He writes in Odia as Hansda, who writes in English. So I propose that the thematically works in this third category of IWE connects to those in the Bhasa literatures, and as one moves closer to the works belonging to the second and third categories, the rupture between IWE and their Bhasa counterparts increases considerably. This is the crux of the new perspective that I am talking about. So when you are at the level where you are talking about the third category, among the Bhasa writers as well as the Indian writers writing in English from the Mufassil town or, from a very small location, their works are comparable. The moment you move upwards in the ladder, second category and third category, the rupture increases. I may be accused of taking the easy way out by identifying a few Indian authors writing in English to clinch my argument. To counter this, I invoke even older writers from Narayan to Ruskin-Bond. Let us compare their works with a couple of lesser-known Bhasa texts dealing with similar themes of juvenile life. But we all know Swami and his friends is about children, juvenile characters. And you have Ruskin-Bond, who writes about life of the children in the mountains, Himalayan mountain range. These two writers, and I'm putting them, both of them write in English, and then I'm putting them alongside an Odia writer of the 1930s and 40s. His name is Lakshmikant Mahapatra. He died very young. His novel is called Kana Mamu, that is One-Eyed Uncle, which was not translated for many decades. I think now it is available in English translation, a very competent English translation. Ruskin Bond's story that I have in mind is The Pool, set in Dehradun of the 1940s and 50s, and of course R.K. Narayan Swami and Friends in Malgudi. I picked these works of fiction because all the three works have children like Swami and his friends for their main action, the action of each of which is also set in three different locations of small town India. They are of Mufassil India. They are yet similar in being not located in big cities. You know, I'm repeating myself. Though Bond's story does not have any adult characters, the two others have a few adult characters as well, with Kanamamu, the one-eyed uncle, being a mature man, his pock-marked face. Like Narayan's novel, Bond's story is in English. Kanamamu is in Odia and is now available in a competent English translation. In Bond's story, the two main characters, Ranji and Suraj, one Punjabi, the other one a Rajput, they speak in impeccable English. Anyway, since we are running out of time, I'll just sum up. To sum up, what I have tried to do here is to slightly shift the focus within the broad rubric of IWE from the excessive attention given to the first category of writers to the other categories. I have also suggested how IWE already is a mind-boggling field, and as academics, it is high time that we begin theorizing this unwieldy and rich corpus and come out of stereotypes created by an earlier generation of critics and historians. Finally, I suggest we avoid setting up a binary between the two rubrics, Indian writing in English and writing in the Indian languages. As we have seen, once we see each of them in terms of the locations of their respective authors, each of the three categories might find its counterpart or mirror image in the bhasas as well. Much work is being done on individual authors, but we need to write critical histories and theorize the field. Much more work needs to be done. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Over to Gautam, or back to Gautam.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very engaging and very important talk. As you said, we often think of Indian writings in English as a uniform, homogeneous bolus, and we commit the same mistake while engaging with Indian writings in Indian languages, the Bhasha literature. And the three categories that you invented for the simplification of our approach to Indian writing in English is very new. I don't think we have heard of these categories earlier. Particularly impressed by the formulation, children of midnight children. That's quite a category, and we need to think through it. The confidence that they exude in their writings and the kind of viewership and the kind of reviews they get, which often eclipses writings in English by authors who are based in regional centers, as you pointed out, the gentleman from Jharkhand. And in fact, that reference reminded me of something which Mahashweta Devi says in Choti Munda and his Arrows. She, as we know, I mean, that work is based on the tribal struggles in Jharkhand. And she says very famously that Daltonganj is the mirror of India. Very often, when we think of India, we think of the urban spaces, as is evident in the writings of the authors of the first two categories that you mentioned. Also, thanks to the diasporic critics, when we think of India, we think of only these spaces, and very rarely do we venture out of them. And then we have the whole Cambridge historians, for whom, might I say, at some peril, Bengal is the mirror of India. So Mahashweta Devi disagrees and makes the intervention there and says Jharkhand is the mirror of India. Well, also the whole point about ideologies being transferred from the first to second category, and how third category, although it shares some of the assumptions of the first two categories, also the third category, as far as I can see, has read a lot of what the first authors in the first two categories have to produce, makes a kind of an intervention, engages with a different kind of India and brings a different understanding. And now that their numbers have increased, Indian writing in English no longer confined to a few diasporic authors or a few Puritans such as Amit Chowdhury. We need to invent new categories. And I really thank you for bringing those things to our attention, sir. The floor is now open for questions. Those of you who have questions, and I'm sure there'll be many, you need to unmute.
Question.
Come on. Yeah. So, can you unmute and identify yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, sir. This is Somya.
Hi, Somya.
Hi,
Please
hello,
go
hello.
ahead.
Sir, thank you so much for the very engaging and informative lecture.
Thank you.
So my question is regarding diasporic writings, of course. Diaspora is a profoundly heterogeneous body of debate, and nevertheless it exhibits this original investment in the nation as a ground or perhaps a master trope of resistance, a claim that might find itself to become complicated in texts like, for instance, The Empire Writes Back, like you just suggested. And especially in the discourse of globalization today, we see that the idea of nation states has been constantly eroding. And therefore, to label certain writers like Salman Rushdie or Desai or Arundhati Roy or Mistry as simply diasporic writers, or to label it as post-colonial colonial writings, does it not limit the possibilities that would be otherwise embedded in the text, and also sort of homogenize these writings to a large extent? And perhaps that's why a lot of authors would shun that kind of categorization, like Amitav Ghosh does.
Mm-hmm. You are very right there, and I think we are on the same page, in so far as the different categories are concerned. The dangers of homogenizing them is concerned, but by and large, though there are specific instances of how the dangers of generalization. By and large, one is really, you look at Rohinton Mistry, for example. His first collection of short stories has only one short story where he is talking about his own experience of racism in Canada. Whereas the other short stories are all about his life in Bombay. And that comes from his memory, and more often than not, it is about projecting the discrimination that people from different castes and communities are faced with, even in metropolitan Bombay.
Right, sir.
So sometimes, critics have noted, people who have read much more than I have, these diasporic writers, they've noted that even Kiran Desai's novel is sometimes accused of a misrepresentation of the community whose life is being depicted. I can't say for sure, but there are others. See, Amitav Ghosh he cannot be clubbed under the same category because it's difficult. As I suggested, some of them are located both here and there.
Right, sir.
So there are some writers who cannot be slotted. I was just looking at their location, and I thought that even when Amitav Ghosh is located in India, in Delhi or in Mumbai or in Goa, he's portraying a different kind of world, which is again, some people accuse, this is not my view, of being bookish, depending on his research rather than first-hand experience. But you are right about not homogenizing the entire category of writers.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Shubha has a question. Shubha, you might like to unmute and ask the question yourself. No, Shubha, you need to be.
I can't hear you.
Hi, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are now audible.
Please put your mic a little close.
Barely audible.
Thanks for the brilliant talk, Professor Satpathy. Satpathy. It was a pleasure listening to you this afternoon. And I have a small query. Can one legitimately homogenize Indianness or genuine Indian reality or experience? And can it alone become a criterion or guarantee of aesthetic value?
This has been debated, and if you ask me, I also feel that it cannot be generalized. There is nothing called essentially Indian. No nation state in the world is as diverse as India is. But still, when writers are removed to a far off place, and the telescopic vision tends to homogenize the landscape. By landscape, I mean the demographic landscape is homogenized through this, what is known as long distance nationalism. So the location is very important. I'm not saying that, I'm not talking about authenticity of Indianness. That is why I used it in the plural, Indiannesses, I said. So there is no authenticity, and yet sometimes we are moved. Even when we don't read books as critics or academics, we just read them for pure fun, and then the way the characters are delineated, situations are delineated, we are really attracted by those. And there is an element of falsity or superficiality about some other kinds of writing, in spite of the technical brilliance. Many of these writers have grown on a diet of modernist writing, fiction or poetry, and their technical skills are unthinkable. And yet the way they construct their plots. Sheuli Chowdhury has this book which is a clone of Ulysses, in the sense that this Bengali migrant is spending just one day in London. I forget the title of the novel. So, that world is not something that an average Indian reader will be able to relate to. So even though there is, even if, one cannot homogenize, one must not, there is nothing called essentially Indian. But there is an attempt on the part of some writers, diasporic writers, to create an India very much like, there are many readers who like Mrs. Moore, who try to find out the real India. Think of discovering the real India in the fiction of such writers. So this is what I am a bit uncomfortable with.
Right. Shibani has a question. My colleague Shibani Phukan. Shibani, you might like to unmute and ask the question.
Yes. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Shibani.
How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you, Shibani.
Sir, my question was, you talked about a number of subcategories that we notice in Indian writing in English. What is interesting to note that if you look at the writing from the Northeast, you have a completely different kind of category of writing that we notice, which is more of a narrativizing of history. That we find literature sort of taking over the role of historians, that we notice, whether it's Mamang Dai or Temsula or
yes.
Goswami. And also the other observation was that the focus does not seem to be on urban middle class India at all. I think the focus, especially in the Northeast, writing from the Northeast, is very much in the rural. And it's interesting because most of these writers are from not necessarily from a rural setup, but the focus is very much the rural parts, the interiors, and the histories of these regions, sir.
Exactly, you have reinforced my point. This is what I wanted to say, and this is true of most of the third category writers, whether they are located in the hinterland of Odisha or Jharkhand or the Northeast. The culture is different. The Adivasi culture that Hansa is narrating is very different from the culture that Akhil Nayak is narrating. But they're all, they are far removed from the writers writing in Odia from Bhubaneswar. or writers located in Delhi or Bombay, Odia writers who write about Odia life. That's very different from the world that these writers are invoking. And look at the work of even Jayanta Mahapatra. Even though he is very well traveled, his work is so local in its imagery, the mythology, the life of the people, the rickshaw puller. There are poems that he has written about the fishermen, fisherwoman in the sea coasts of Puri or Balasore. So, this kind of micro focus is which is the hallmark of the third category of writers. Whereas the diasporic writers have a more globalized vision. It's a macro view of India rather than a micro view of India, whatever. And I'm not talking about authenticity at all. I hope that makes it clear.
Yes, sir.
Suneeta Patnayak, you might like to ask the question yourself?
Are there students, Gautam?
Yeah, there are quite a few students, sir.
I would like to take a question.
Yes, sir. We have plenty of time, sir.
Okay, good. That's very good to hear. Because you sent me a notice. You sent me a notice. So
Can I proceed?
Yes, please.
Good evening, Dr. Satpathy. It is so nice to be on the virtual screen with you.
Thank you very much.
Great privilege and very interesting talk. I just would like to know, how would you describe the new crop of writers, the children of the Midnight's children, with context to the very ironic description by Raja Rao of Indian writers as writers who think quickly, we talk quickly, and we move quickly, because it has something to do with the son of India. So would you like to say something about that?
You tell me. You tell me. See, I have already dwelt on the subject, and I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What is your experience? Then maybe
because I probably partially believe in his description of Indian writers, because we do tend to digress a little. I mean, I teach Fakirmohan Serapathy's 6 Acres and a Third, and extremely interesting rendition, narration. It has a very different kind of ironic context to the way he tells the tale. But it is a fact that he tells the tale in a different manner. So, and I see that in many other writers also. So, I would like to hear from you, your opinion.
I'll give you a completely different example and ask you, I'll throw another question. And I take my cue from Namvar Singh's excellent reading of Chandrakanta. His essay was transcribed. It was a lecture. It is transcribed, and it occurs in Meenakshi Mukherjee edited volume of Early Indian Writing. And Namvar Singh says that in our definition of the novel, we say that Chandrakanta, written in Hindi, had not acquired the form of the novel. It's denied. It's denied the generic status of finished novelistic works like those of, say, Bankim's novels, or the other novels which followed, Premchand's novel. It is not supposed to be a novel in the true sense of the term. Now, to this, Namvar Singh says, okay, there was a time in the 1960s or 70s we thought of Chandrakanta like that, but now we are talking about magic realism. Now, if you look at the way these novels, like the realistic, magic realist novels are structured, in a way you can say that Chandrakanta is, it fits the bill. You can call it a novel of magical realism. So our own definition, we are trapped by our own definitions. So when we are talking about Fakirmohan Senapati, 1900, this was one of the earliest novels in India. It's not the earliest, but one of the earliest novels in India. And Fakirmohan is referring to Rebecca, is referring to Scott, and then he's referring to Bankim. He is trying to figure out how a novel should be written. And you can see that his novels are have titles on the based on the characters, Ramchandra Mangaras, Champa, Gaya Saria, and so on and so forth. You can clearly see that it's the same form which was evolving, that is short biographies. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's biographies which are translated into Odia. So in the novel also characters are delineated exactly the way historical short biographies of historical characters were being written then. So this is the novel which is evolving, Indian novel in Indian languages. And 35 years later, when Raja Rao is writing this novel, see, no one attempted a novel, or if we did, or if he did, we don't know of it, after Rajmohan's Wife by Bankim. Nobody else tried to write a novel in English until these big three came, Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand, and R.K. Narayan. Now they are also struggling with the idea of writing. They are also thinking about whether an Indian experience can be couched in a foreign language. So there are problems, when the novel is being written initially. But much later, Midnight Children and afterwards, there is a far greater confidence for an Indian writer writing in English that we can do it as well as anybody else in the world. How does it happen? How does this transformation happen? There is no apologia. There is an apologia in R.K. Narayan. Sorry, apologia in Raja Rao, Kantapura. And even when women writers are writing, they are always defensive. If not explicitly, the way they are writing, you can see there's a lot of timidity about the writing. Now that is gone by the time you come to someone like Kamala Das.
Yes.
Right, sir. There's a bit of a anecdotal trivia there. The dubious distinction, the reputation of Chandrakanta Santati was because its author Devaki Nandan Khatri was not on good terms with Shyam Sundar Das, the person in charge of Nagari Pracharni Sabha. So he gave very bad reviews to his works, and that sort of continued in the tradition. I think we have time for 3 more questions, 4 at most.
Okay, very good.
I'll ask a question that's being sent by somebody following your lecture on Facebook Live. Dr. Rashmi Bhal, she has a question. What changes can come in Indian writings, whether it is in English or Hindi, during COVID-19 or after the pandemic?
Oh, see, there is already a lot of writing happening on Facebook blog, and I get many poems. They are either explicit COVID poems or indirectly philosophical reflections. They are being forwarded to us by the Yahoo Mail group that we are in iClass and English literature, English teachers Yahoo ID. So there's a lot that is happening already. Now, I don't know whether it is physically possible to actually, it's like emergency literature, these are all very topical, and maybe very few will survive the test of time. The topicality is such. So emergency, I remember John Oliver Perry edited a volume called Emergency Literature or Emergency Poetry. Nobody reads those. Nobody. Kind of protest poetry. Everybody wrote from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. But how many of us remember? There is more of emergency literature in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children or Rohinton Mistri's work. Not a fine balance, but the other one. So I think there will be a change surely, but it will be more in the sphere of reception than in themes. Because our attitude towards life has changed, or is people are saying that we are not the same. Pre-COVID and post-COVID, we are very different. Our attitude towards life, nature. So if that is the case, then rather than the theme and the treatment, the reception, the production, those aspects of Indian writing in English or Indian literature might undergo change.
We have a question from a student, KR Swati. Swati, you should unmute and ask the question. Swati, can you hear me?
She has to unmute herself.
Swati, I have unmuted you. Swati?
Sir, thank you so much. It really helps. Sir, my question would be that being a part of urban society, if we write any rural stories, how can we ensure that such stories of the rural culture do not condone cultural appropriation?
Do not condone or conform. What is the question?
Sir, I asked that how can we ensure that these rural stories written by urban folks do not condone cultural appropriation?
I'm not very sure what you are saying, but it's about, if we do not have first-hand experience of life in villages and having lived in urban spaces all our life, we just try to imagine and recreate the life of the rural poor. It can be a bit again superficial. I don't know. See, Mahasweta Devi lived among the tribal population, and she wrote about their lives. Gopinath Mahanti of Paraja fame also, what is known as in situ, from within. There are writers who locate themselves there and they write. Now, I have a different take on that from the point of view of post-colonial theory. When we condemn Conrad because he travels to the Congo, and after a year or so, he writes about his experience and he delineates the Black Africans in a certain way, and Chinua Achebe calls him a racist. And we are very happy with Mahasweta Devi or Gopinath Mahanti traveling to or living among the so-called tribes and writing about their lives. Are we not doing what Conrad had done? So if we think that this is worth doing in India, perhaps what Conrad did was also worth doing according to him. So I do not know how we look at these two differently. And rural, urban, it's like a kind of poverty tourism. How do we create literature? Actually, I asked one Odia writer, just one observation. I asked one Odia writer. She, one of her stories about hunger moved us to tears. So I called her. I said, it's a beautiful story, but I never thought you, she's now of course in Delhi. This was about 15 years ago. How do you understand this kind of life in rural Odisha? You lived in Bhubaneswar, you were educated there. She said, no, sir, I have my relatives there, my grandparents and uncles. So from our childhood days, during vacation, we go to our village, we live there. So I have seen this kind of life since I was a child. So she could write about it in such a way that us readers could identify them. So it's not about appropriating their life. It's about empathizing with the kind of life they lived.
Right. We have one question from Nikita Taneja. Nikita, I think she's from, the question is, she's following our lecture on Facebook Live. I'll read out the question to you, sir.
Okay, so, okay.
So what do you think about the dystopian fiction that is emerging from IWA, considering Prayag Akbar and Samit Basu's latest work?
See, I've just read one or two of them. I'm not familiar with the rest of their works, but I think they're very evocative, and they capture a kind of reality. What is dystopian fiction? It's projecting the future on the basis of what we are experiencing now. And you know, what Orwell could do, what Orwell could predict or forecast in 1984 was on account of his first-hand experience of the communist world in Eastern Europe. So these writers similarly are located at a time when they see certain tendencies emerging, majoritarianism and so on and so forth, and what is known as um, you know, with all these apps that and Aadhaar, you know, there is a threat to our privacy. So there is a kind of surveillance happening. So people are projecting a similar kind of dystopic future for ourselves. And, you know, it's quite, you know, some people have a taste for it. I'm more of an optimist, so I personally, this is my personal response. It's great work of fiction, no doubt about it. But if you ask me whether I enjoy it or not, I would rather say that I would have a brighter view of the future.
Anslin from Chennai has a question.
Okay.
We are on time. Can you ask that? If Anslin there, she can ask herself, okay, or I'll read out the question. Anslin, can you follow me? I'll read out the question to you, sir.
Okay.
The question is about what could be paradigm shift in the selection of themes in the post-COVID-19 scenario. What are the possible areas that they can focus on? And if I can link that to something which Shubha had to add about the theme of homecoming, given the migrant crisis, would that be one of the areas that the IWE should look into? And what are the other possibilities? What are the other areas that they must explore?
You know, I will first address the second question about migrant population. Now, I was discussing the issue of migrancy, you know, with some of my friends, young friends, and I said, look, those who have gone abroad, leaving India behind, their own homeland behind, they're called diasporic. And these laborers who leave their homeland and they come to the cities to work, they're called migrants. And they're looked down upon wherever, whether it is Punjab or Bihar. Now they want the migrant laborers to come back so that the economy can be revived. The builders can get their own profit. And, you know, this is complete hypocrisy. Look at the way, you know, these people have moved. It's like, it's worse than what had happened in the 19th century when a large number of you know, indentured laborers were taken to far off places like the West Indies or African nations where they were made to work. But they must have lived a life of dignity, and you know, as you can see, V.S. Naipaul is a product of that diaspora, and Rohan Kanhai is a product of that diaspora, or Chandrapal is a product of that diaspora. Now, they've lived a life of great dignity, whereas these migrant laborers, you know, so the whole idea of diaspora, migrancy, exile, the way we academics sitting in the first world theorize about these categories, do we ever, or shall we ever, take into account the problem faced by the migrants? Can we write, can we speak for the subaltern of this kind, you know, to alter Gayatri Spivak's rhetorical question slightly? So certainly I'm hopeful that sensitive writers would be able to, at least in the Indian languages, if not in English, Indian writers in languages, because they are actually, these Indian writers who are located in small towns and villages in India would know the plight of the migrants when they are coming back, they are dying or starving, and they would be able to write about their lives in a different way. So they should or can represent the life of the migrants in a way that's really that would be welcome. And to go back to the first question about post-COVID scenario, whether there will be a paradigm shift is the question, right?
No, the areas where the authors of IWE must focus or can focus profitably?
No, I think she mentioned the COVID or something.
Yeah,
like
she mentioned in the background what are the areas that the new writers, the young authors in Indian IWE should focus on.
It's too early to say, actually. It will be very difficult. I don't know how writers, as a great writer said once, writers are the antenna of the races in a way. So I'm sure, since I'm not a writer, so I'm just a critic. The moment they write, I pounce on their writing and I tear them apart. So I can't really speak for the writers. I do not know how their imagination works, but I'm sure some of them would be able to create some wonderful themes around the COVID experience. That is, if we manage to survive. Already, much before COVID, there have been films in Hollywood about virus and biological warfare and so on and so forth. And many people are really struck by the similarity between the futuristic imagination of the script writers of these films and the experience now, the horrifying experience now. So I'm sure writers would be able to do it, and I'm sure there'll be a new kind of literature. Though it can only be one of the themes, and the perspective may be very different. Talking about the world, already there is a lot of creativity happening in the WhatsApp messages that one receives. A lot of humor, a lot of nostalgia about the world as it is, the world that we have lost. But now we can have a glimpse of that world that we have lost due to technology. So I think these are great times to look forward to.
Thank you so much, sir. And I really take this opportunity to thank you to bring new perspectives, to simplify so many things that were difficult for us to understand. And might I say that we had a session on 12th where two authors came and spoke on Gramsci and the need to revisit Gramsci and Althusser. And quite ironically, one of them suggested that we should return to the idea of constructive program. And the other one said that non-violence is the way to tackle state censorship and state imposition of social distancing. And that, in a sense, made a compelling case for inclusion of Gandhi in the syllabus. They came to us with a perspective to rethink Marx, but ended up making a case for Gandhi. And today, again, there are quite a few takeaways, new ways of looking at literature, new ways of looking at criticism, because you also spoke of the way diasporic critics are responsible for the canonization of the diasporic authors and the need to move beyond. Thank you so much, sir. I also take this opportunity to thank our principal, Dr. Gyantosh Jha, the members of the webinar committee, Dr. Vinita Tuli, Dr. Anju Bajaj, our friends, Baljeet ji, Ravindra Pantji, all my colleagues, all the students, and particularly Professor Sutanu Satpathy for sparing the afternoon. Thank you so much, sir. Final utilitarian announcement. Feedback form has been circulated on the chat group. Download that form, fill it up. You will be issued an e-certificate based on that.
Gautam, before we end, I wanted to thank your technical team for an impeccable job they have done. Without a glitch, a single glitch. This is a miracle. Thank you very much, technology team.
Ravindra, would you like to respond to that, Ravindra?
Sir, it was really nice talk, and we welcome you. And the team is working day and night to make the success. And when such programs take place, so that is all we always like to have. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Ravinder, and thank you, Gautam, and thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.